A reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verses 10 through 31. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side. So neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, John. Well, we are 1 week into our new sermon series through the book of Exodus called Formed to be Truly Human. And we're looking at this because I think the question of what it means to be human is a big topic that we need to be thinking about and addressing. People are not sure what it actually does. What does it mean to be human with the rise of technology and AI and lots of things that are, again, pushing the boundaries as to what it means to be human. And we're picking up the story in the book of Exodus as the Israelites are now journeying after they've been freed from Pharaoh into their wandering in the wilderness. So they've been freed as slaves, and now they're being formed for a relationship with the God who saved them. And during these 40 years in the wilderness, they're learning to be truly human now, fully under God. Or in other words, they're being spiritually formed to live the life that they were always meant to live under God. as one writer said, because it took 4 days to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get the Egypt out of Israel. And this wilderness pilgrimage, this sort of spiritual formation, is a template for the Christian life. And I think it'll be helpful as we look at sort of how Israel is formed for us to ask the questions and learn the basics of what it looks like to build a life on following God. Now, today, as John just read, is a very long passage that we read, but it's also a very famous passage as we come to the crossing of the Red Sea that Moses takes them through. And this is a very famous, I'm sure if you know anything about the Bible or anything about Christianity or Judaism, I'm sure you've heard about Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. And this is a very famous passage for good reason. Because in the entire Old Testament, this is the greatest act of God saving his people for himself that becomes a paradigm for how God saves his people today, even you and I. And so understanding what's happening really in this passage is going to be very, very key to understanding what Christianity is all about. So you might think that this is a lovely story or something that you understand what's happening, but if you can miss all the fine points, and therefore you can miss what Christianity is all about. Because you see, Christianity talks a lot about the word salvation. This idea that we need to be saved from something. You might not agree with that, but today we're going to actually see why we need a salvation and how we particularly get it. And you might not think that you are in need of any kind of saving, but we're going to see today that all of us, no matter who we are, we're enslaved. We're captivated by, we're controlled by something. And the question is going to be, who can free us? Who can save us from that? So let's look at that by asking 3 questions. We're looking at 3 things here in our passage. We'll flow through it pretty nicely. First, let's look at the Israelites' fear that we see. And then let's look at Moses' trust. And then finally, the Lord's salvation. So the Israelites' fear, Moses' trust, and the Lord's salvation. So let's jump right in. First, like we mentioned last week, the book of Exodus is all about God saving his people from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh. Right, so for 430 plus years, the Israelites were enslaved. They were oppressed by Pharaoh. And so the Lord raises up Moses as this mediator, as this savior figure, to go and rescue them. And that's exactly what Moses does. We skip through it, and we're not preaching through it. But we see earlier on in Exodus that through the 10 plagues that God rains down on Egypt, Pharaoh finally relents and lets his people go. And God has now promised to take Israel to the promised land, to the land of Canaan, where the land will be flowing with milk and honey, which means there will be so many resources. They will have the abundant kind of life that a slave had never got to experience or witness, but God has promised for his people. But, we also mentioned last week, this isn't a kind of freedom from just slavery. What God is doing is he is freeing them for a relationship now with him, with God, under their true master, to live the kind of life that he had always intended his people to live. So that's what brings us to kind of our passage. And we skip the first 10 verses. So let me summarize what happens in chapter 14 right before we get to our passage. Because right in our passage, we see the Israelites being led by God, not directly to the land of Canaan, but toward the Red Sea. And when that happens, Pharaoh sees what's happening to the Israelites, and he says, these guys don't know what they're doing. What have I done in letting my slaves go? Think about all the economic benefit that I'm going to lose if I just let the Israelites walk. And so Pharaoh has a change of mind. He sends 600 of his strongest warriors and chariots to go back after Israel because they think Israel is being led wrongly and that they're stuck in confusion. And so that's what kind of brings us to our passage, right? The Israelites are trapped between the Red Sea and the barreling Pharaoh army coming after them. And that's where we pick it up in verse 10. Look with me here, because I think we learn a lot about Israel's response to this particular situation. It says that they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Now, they're terrified. Again, they're pinned, they're literally on the shore of this large body of water with nowhere to go. And their oppressive bullies for generations, who's much more powerful than them, much more technologically advanced than them, much better at warfare than them, is coming right for them. And in their fear, the Israelites' formation is revealed. What do I mean by that? In their fear, what is revealed is what they are really believing and what they are really trusting, who they really are in their inner world. Because in their response, we see that in their minds, only two options are possible in this moment. Number one, either going back to slavery, or number two, imminent death. There's no other option for the Israelites. And you might think that that's understandable because this is a really difficult predicament. But I don't really think so. Because if you track through the story of Exodus, you would have seen that the Israelites just witnessed this God deliver them from the hand of Pharaoh through miraculous 10 plagues. Pharaoh relented because he saw how strong and powerful the Lord was. And not to mention, the Lord that delivered them, this divine warrior that was shown to them, was now walking with them in their presence through a pillar of cloud and fire. And yet, they don't see that or understand that, but these circumstances actually bring out what's deeply ingrained in the very hearts of the Israelites. And their response of fear and terrified fear actually shows them and to us that Israel in this moment is much more controlled by the fear of Egypt than they are trusting in the Lord. That is to say, they are absolutely still enslaved under the hand of Pharaoh. See, most of us today probably don't think that we are enslaved or encapsulated or controlled by anything. You know, we have this big narrative in our world that individualism and freedom is one of our highest key values, and we probably think that we are the captain of our ships, driving our lives exactly how we want it to go. Friends, I'm here to tell you that is just not true. Every single one of us is controlled by something much bigger than us. Every single one of us is in some ways enslaved by, right, captured by something, someone much, much greater than us. If you want to know what that is, all you have to do is think through, what is it that you spend your time on? Where does your money most easily flow to? Or what do you most just daydream about? When you start to ask those questions, you start to see, oh, right, there is some sort of a vision of a good life that I am after that is ordering how I think and how I behave. Or another way to figure that out, maybe the most powerful way to figure out what is controlling you is, just like the Israelites, look at your fears. Fear is one of the most paralyzing, most intense emotions that can tell us a lot about ourselves. And one way to figure out what is controlling us is to actually play out the nightmare test. See, what scenario in your life, if it happened, would be your absolute worst case scenario that would make you respond and react like Israel does in this passage? Utterly terrified. Something you want to avoid at all costs. You think death is going to be imminent. What is that thing that is your worst nightmare coming true? Losing your job? Losing your bank account? I don't know. Maybe losing a person? Losing a relationship? Not having a relationship? Being humiliated in front of a particular kind of crowd? Not getting the approval of someone that you desperately want their approval of? What is it that you would be crying out, terrified, you would do everything possible to not make happen? That's the thing that has a power over us. It controls us, right? Our fears drive and control our lives much more than we can imagine, which actually shows that we are much more enslaved by things than we actually think. You know, a much more subtler way in which this might play out, particularly here in New York, is this example that I read through this great book by Greg McKeown called Essentialism. I was reading it because I was like, oh my gosh, I am so busy, you know, and he had this great sort of picture of a circle with like 100 arrows pointing out that are like an inch long, and then one circle with one straight arrow going straight up. And the premise of his book is essentially this. He's saying that saying no to all the non-essential things, learning to say no to all the non-essential things is critical if you actually want to spend your energy not scattered across a bunch of things, but spent on the most important things that are unique to you, that's part of your calling. But most of us actually spend our time doing a ton of different things and not focused on the essentials. And he says this, and this is kind of where I want to take it. He says this is a particular danger for people who are very gifted and that are very talented or very productive. See, your gift is what allows you to probably excel at places at work. Because here's what happens. Because you're very good at something, when you do it well, you get a lot of affirmation. You get a lot of praise. You get a lot of recognition. It starts to open a lot of doors for you. And then over time, what it says is when those situations come up again, they start to say, oh, well, actually, we need you back on this, Jack, because you're so good at it. And when you were younger, you got a lot of validation from that. Oh, yeah, I need to do that. I should do that. But what happens over time is that you end up saying yes to a whole bunch of non-essential things, and you no longer are spending time on the essentials. And what that does is it leads to burnout. It leads to a kind of life that you never imagined. It leads to you hating work. It leads to you not having any kind of clarity in your life. Now, why is that? Why is it that a lot of us probably here in this room fall right into this category? It is absolutely because we are afraid of what we will lose if we don't get that recognition, if we don't get that approval, if doors don't start opening up for us. What does that say about me? What does that say about my career? What does it say about my trajectory? We are much more controlled by the need for approval or the loss of it, which is why your gifts can often betray you. And it has a kind of power over you. It is controlling what motivates you and how you spend your time, what you look at, where your energies go, absolutely. And this isn't just true of work, right? By the way, this can absolutely also happen in a church context. In particular, this feedback loop of validation and approval can be even more dangerous in a religious context like the church, because we're saying, oh, we love God, and I want to grow a relationship with him, and so that's why I'm coming, and that's why I'm getting involved, and that's why I'm doing all of these things, while all the while it's actually not really for God. It's for us. It's because we want desperately to know that someone sees us and we're validated because we can do a lot of things and make things happen, and people say, oh, we're so glad that you're here, you're doing such a great job. See, we're much more controlled by those things than we tend to think, which means we're enslaved by much more than we tend to think. All of us, we're held captive. We're enslaved. We're just like Israel. And here's the thing. That kind of a life, living that way, was never how we were meant to live. Chasing that kind of approval, living your life until burnout, doing these things that nobody asked you to do, and then getting upset and stressed about it. No one asked you to do those things. And that's not how God had always intended for you and I to live. But the incredible thing about us is that we are creatures of habit that can make something that was meant to be so abnormal, an unflourishing, deteriorating life, a burning out kind of a life, we can make that absolutely normal. The life that we were never meant for, we can make ours. And that's what we see in our text, right? One of the saddest things that we see is that Israel starts clamoring to go back into slavery, under captivity to Egypt. They say, it would be better if we never even made it out. You should have left us under the oppressive hand of Pharaoh. They want to go back into bondage because they have no vision for real life, what an abundant life with God is meant to look like. And when you don't have an abundant life and then you're filled with fear, what that will always cause you to do is to run back to the thing that you just know. Run back to the habits that you've had. Run back to the kind of life that you were never meant for. Here's what one commentator says about this, particularly in a Christian walk standpoint. He says, we decide to follow Christ, but as soon as we start having problems, we get scared and go right back to our old ways of coping, anger, addiction, depression, distraction. No matter how much we used to hate it, there was security in the way that we used to live. And so we return to the same old harmful relationships, the same old sinful attitudes, and the same old nasty habits. And this, my friends, is the very thing that God is trying to truly save Israel from. Still being enslaved by the fear of Egypt, living out the desires of wanting to go back into captivity under Egypt. And so even though they have been technically brought out of that land and out of slavery, you can see that in their fearful hearts and minds, they're still dominated and enslaved by the fear of Pharaoh, because 430 years of slavery runs deep into your bones. And that is the thing that God really wants to free Israel from. And we see that coming out in their fears. But here's the second point. How does Moses respond? It's a very different response, not only to the situation, but also to the fear and the anxieties of the people of Israel. And in some ways, Moses kind of gives us a picture of how Israel should have responded, given what was true about the God that was revealed to them. Moses has a very, very different response. Here's what he says starting in verse 13. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord that he will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you need only to be still." Moses is the man. That's such a courageous and confident response. But I want us to look carefully, because if we think Moses is the man, we're actually going to entirely miss what this passage is about. Because when you look carefully, you see why he can respond in such a different way, with such boldness and confidence and trust. And it is not because he has any faith in himself. Right? A lot of how we tend to read the Bible, how we read any narrative, is that we want to be the heroes. We think that we're meant to be the heroes. It's sort of this hero narrative that we have. That's not what Moses is thinking at all. It's also not because Moses knows the future. He's in the same boat as the Israelites right now. He has no idea that the way God is going to show up is by parting the Red Sea through this miraculous thing. So how is it that he can respond very, very differently? And that's because, it has to be, because there are some key differences in what Moses believes to be true in the same exact circumstances. There are at least three things that we see that Moses believes absolutely to be true that roots his confidence in this kind of a response. Number one, look at what he says. He says, "The Lord will fight for you." He knows this is not your battle. It's not Moses' battle. It's God's battle. He is the divine warrior that has already brought them out and will continue to do so. God is the one who's going to fight this battle, not you. And that's really good news, because Israel is literally the punk, small little kid that's been beaten up for generations. It's got no shot against the chariots of Pharaoh that's coming and barreling down toward them. But Moses isn't scared because he knows that God is the one who's going to fight their battle. But it's not just that, because here's the second thing. Because there could be okay, God's going to fight against Pharaoh. Let's see what happens. I hope my God wins. But no, here's the second thing that Moses is absolutely sure of. That God is much more powerful than Pharaoh. Their divine warrior, their champion, is greater, is stronger, has proven more powerful already, and he trusts that to be true. And you know, throughout this entire segment of Exodus, one of the key motifs in the book of Exodus is actually the comparison between God, Yahweh, that was revealed to Moses, and Pharaoh as sort of this rival false god. And who is stronger? Who has claim over Israel? And time again, God continues to show up to see that God is proven over and over again that he's much greater, much more powerful than Pharaoh. That's the second thing that Moses has to know for him to respond like this. But then thirdly, look at what he says. He says, "The Egyptians that you see today, that you are so afraid of, you will never see again." Moses is believing that God is going to keep his promise and that he will fully deliver the Israelites from the hand of Pharaoh. That even though Moses had no idea how God was going to show up in this particular moment, in the greatest moment of need, he had a fundamental trust that he is going to be good on his word, that he's going to be good on making his promise to fully deliver them. And you see, Moses' response, compared to the Israelites, Moses' response is based on an entirely different reality of who this God is and what he has promised to do. And we see that when that is the case, you can respond utterly differently to the same exact kind of situations that you might face. Utterly differently. Let's go back for a minute to our nightmare test that we were just thinking about. You're like, I finally stopped thinking about my nightmares. Now you're bringing us back. Yeah. The thing that is controlling you, the thing that is enslaving you. Let's go back to that for a moment, right? If you consider yourself a Christian here, you see the reason why that particular scenario is so scary to you is because deep down into your bones, you don't believe some or all of these things to be true about God. Let me say that again. When you go back to the thing that is making you so afraid of life, the reason why, if you are a Christian, is that you don't believe deep down in one or two or all three of these things to be true of the God who has saved you. You see, where does anxiety come from? Anxiety comes from having to deal with the future that you are ill-equipped to handle. Anxiety is literally afraid of what might happen that you're not prepared to do. See, if you don't believe that God is with you and is going to fight for you and he's going with you, you will absolutely be filled with anxiety. If you don't believe that God is the one that is doing this work for you and you have to pick up the battle swords and go to the front lines yourself to face this life, you will absolutely be filled with anxiety. Why is that we're filled with fear? Because the consequences of our nightmares seem too much, too big for us to handle. And that is because we don't trust that God is bigger than our circumstances, bigger than those consequences. We don't see or trust how he might show up in a very different way to bring you to a very different kind of conclusion. That's why fear racks our hearts. Or we become hopeless because you don't actually trust that powerful God that could do something will do something, because we don't trust that he really loves us, that he's good on his promises, that he will never leave you nor forsake you, that he has your ultimate good in mind, even if the situation and circumstances do not look like it. And this is essentially living in the world where this God that has been revealed to you and to Israel through Scripture, through this theophany of a pillar of cloud and fire, does not exist. See, we're filled with that in our inner world because this God who has revealed himself does not exist. We don't trust it. We don't believe it. And that's what's happening inside the hearts of the Israelites. And to that, Moses actually commands the Israelites three different things. He says, do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord deliver you today. You need only to be still. Just be still. See, Moses is telling these overwhelmed Israelites that because the Lord is going to show up on your behalf, what your role is to do is to calm your heart that is freaking out, thinking the worst case scenarios, thinking that you are doomed, and to teach it to trust, to be still and know that he is God who loves you, is with you, and will protect you. He's saying, don't let your heart run wild to all of those worst case scenarios, because that is essentially a picture of a heart that is living apart from God, and that means you are ultimately enslaved to some other kind of a future. And that is the very thing that God is after. A true freedom for Israel and for you and I that will only come if we learn to completely trust him deep into our bones about who he is and what he has promised to do, so that we can respond like Moses rather than having our hearts run wild with the worst case scenarios full of fear. You know, when I was reading this, one of the passages that just kind of kept coming up to me is in a lot of the synoptic gospels, but particularly in Mark chapter 4, you actually see Jesus in a boat with his disciples and a storm comes. You know about this story? And Jesus my man is sleeping in the back of the boat. It's probably a pretty small boat, smaller than this stage. And the storm is coming, and the disciples think that they're about to die, and they start freaking out, and they're terrified, and they wake up Jesus, and they say, Lord, don't you care that we're about to die? And Jesus says, why are you so afraid? He gets up and he says, be still to the waters. And he says, why are you so afraid? He's basically saying, don't you know who you are with right now? I'm the Lord over all creation. These things obey me, and I'm with you. Why are you so afraid? See, Moses shows us a kind of life with God that fully trusts him, and it leads to a very different kind of response, a very different kind of inner world in the same exact circumstances. But here's our final and third point, that we will only get there to this point of Moses' reaction and response if we too see the Lord's salvation, right? How he shows up for his people to save them. You know, John read it. It was hard to cut out any part of that passage because there's so much drama and there's so much action. And this is sort of this climactic passage in all of Exodus where the rival gods of Pharaoh versus God, there's this big showdown that's happening. But we read that it's really not a fair fight because God knows exactly what he is doing, and he's planning all of this for his glory and for Israel's good. And so what happens is that God tells Israel to continue marching on toward the sea. Okay, God, I believe you. I trust you. There's a measure of faith that Israel is using there to continue on toward the sea. And as they do, the Lord tells Moses to stretch out your hand across the sea. And when he does, he parts the Red Sea so that the Israelites walk across it on dry land with a wall of water side to side. And as he does that, he hardened the heart of the Egyptians to follow after them in all of their technology, all of their power. Their entire 600 chariots go rushing in to try to chase them down. And as soon as the Israelites cross over into safety, into this new land, Moses again stretches out his arms across the sea, and the waves come crashing down. And in one fell swoop, this powerful army of Pharaoh is completely obliterated. And we read that not one of them survived, making true what Moses had promised to the Israelites, that you will no longer see them after today. Now, what's happening here? There is at the same time the full and complete judgment of God's enemies that is necessary for the salvation of his people. That the moment that he brings those waves and waters crashing down over Israel's greatest enemy, and therefore God's greatest enemy, is the same moment that Israel is actually saved, truly made free. Because here's the thing, only after this moment does Israel have true and real freedom from Egypt. See, it's not just about leaving the land and no longer being slaves. It's not just about winning a battle against Pharaoh. He had already done that in the 10 plagues. But unless Pharaoh's army, the enemy, was completely defeated, in the back of Israel's mind would always be what? What if they come back? What if they regroup? What if Pharaoh gets stronger? And all the while, the Israelites would always be living in fear, running, not living, looking over their shoulder at Pharaoh and their former masters coming back after them. But instead, whatever anxiety, whatever fear that the Israelites must have had in their slavery mindset, they could always now look back to the Exodus and what God had done definitively in the Red Sea to know and trust that they are free, no matter what the emotions of their heart might be telling them in that moment. And you see, friends, this is the moment that Israel's status changed. Crossing over on the Red Sea behind Moses was the same thing as the Israelites crossing over from death to life. From absolute imminent death and slavery, they crossed over into life. They're now free for a relationship with this God who has now promised to take care of them, to heal them, to renew them, and to get this slavery mindset off of them, but only after he first shows up and they experience his saving power of the Lord. That's what allows them to now trust and follow. And that's the very thing that changes them. We see it in our verse 30, the end of the passage. Look with me. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, The people feared the Lord, and they put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. What a remarkable change, friends. They were once fearful and trembling of Pharaoh, and now that very fear has been transformed into the fear of the Lord. That is to say, not a kind of, I'm afraid of you, God, but more so an awestruck wonder at the power of what God can actually do for them. A kind of fear that leads to a complete and utter belief and trust in him. And you see, this is why understanding this story clearly is paramount for us to understand what salvation is in the Christian story. Because God's salvation here in the Red Sea is a paradigm for salvation in the entire Bible, at the heart of what Christianity talks about. Because Christianity, my friends, is not about following the rules and obeying God so well that he ultimately accepts you or loves you and brings you into his family. Because what we see here in this passage is that God does not wait for you and I to get our act together before he brings you into new life. Because like we saw, if it was up to us, we would absolutely choose slavery over freedom. We would absolutely go back to Egypt the moment things hit the fan. God doesn't wait, knowing that we prefer life as slaves in Egypt. And Christianity is also not about saving ourselves. See, Moses is not the true hero of this story. This passage shows us who we really are. We are not the heroes of our stories. This passage shows us that who we are, these terrified Israelites, that is our true state, that is absolutely weak and powerless against our greatest enemies, the things that enslave us without us even knowing. And it reminds us that burnout, death, enslavement is absolutely a certainty from us apart from what God can do. Instead, friends, this is what Christianity is. It is God acting decisively and definitively. God acting decisively and definitively to truly save us for a relationship with him by taking on our greatest enemy, much greater than Pharaoh, much greater than 600 chariots. Our greatest enemy that really separates us from God, that really leads us to true spiritual death, and that is sin and death. See, sin is the reason why we are full of fear and anxiety, guilt and shame, why our hearts run wild all the time thinking through worst case scenarios. Sin is the reason why we live in a world apart from God as if we're on our own, that rightly deserves death and judgment. But Christianity is about a mediator who comes just like Moses, who is not afraid, who stands firm, and whose heart is still even as he looks down the barrel of a charging great army, greater than Pharaoh, our ultimate enemy in sin and death, the thing that really separates us. Because you see, my friends, Moses is only pointing to the greater and truer Moses, and that's Jesus Christ. And the Red Sea crossing, this miracle of salvation, is only pointing us, is a mere shadow of the miracle of what happens on the cross, where judgment and salvation both simultaneously happen for our sake. You see, the judgment and the death that we deserved, looking to be enslaved by anything other than God, living our lives apart from God, the thing that we deserve, that judgment doesn't come down on us. It comes down on him, on Jesus. And he takes that all on. Why? Because that is the only way that his people can be freed, truly freed, saved, forgiven. Salvation can only come through what Christ has done for you. And in him, and only in him, do we cross over from death to life, from slavery to real, true, complete freedom. And apart from him, our situation is bad. But in him and him alone, through the miracle of salvation on what Christ does on the cross, we can finally start living the life that we were meant for. Friends, once you experience this kind of salvation like the Israelites did, it changes everything. It changes your outlook. This is the very remedy that you need for your guilt, for your shame, for your fear and your anxieties. Because now you too can look back at what Christ has done on the cross definitively to say, he is with me. He does love me. And he has made a way. So my heart can be still and know that he is God.